I'm Dan Snow. Welcome to Voices of the First World War. In the years leading up to the centenary of the war, the last of those who actually experienced it have passed away. But the Imperial War Museums and the BBC had recorded interviews with many veterans to try to capture what it was like to actually be there. This series listens to those stories.
It was heavy clay soil. They were cut down to a depth of about 6 feet through the roots of the trees, and the trenches were cut down and the water ran down the sides of the trenches all day.
You walked about on clay, and it was clay as you dug it out of the side. It was clay as you tried to make a step to get out of the trench when relief came. Just clay all over you.
In 1914, soldiers quickly realised, with horror, that technology had turned battlefields into killing zones. Desperate to seek shelter, they clawed into the very earth beneath their feet. The result? Trenches. Refuges hacked out by soldiers. They've come to symbolise the First World War.
You were put in a cornfield and you were told to dig yourself in. Well, I don't know if you've seen what an entrenching tool looks like in the army. This is how you had to dig yourself in. You might as well have been a rabbit, really, because you couldn't dig anything, and you made a bit of a hole in the ground with your trenching tool. And then you took up a position, and then the party started. When I mean the party started, the Hun came along in his hordes.
At night, the men would dig down further. The holes were deepened and joined together to form a shallow trench, still little more than a ditch. As the war dragged on, these developed into an elaborate subterranean system. Deep trenches linking bunkers, concrete strongpoints and tunnels. It was highly unusual to see a human being above the ground during the day. But for the first few months, trenches were very rudimentary. Sergeant George Ashurst was stationed near Le Bizet, near Armentières, a fairly quiet sector.
There was only a hole in the floor. That's all they were. A long trench of about, 10 yards or so was our particular trench. Mine and 4 other men. You couldn't get into them. You had to slide on your bottom to get in the trench. And before you could get out, you had to dig steps in the side so that you could get out. The next trench was flooded, really. The next piece, like mine, was flooded. So nobody used that.
There was no drainage, of course. They were half full of water most of the time. It seemed to rain every day.
Percy Douglas was interviewed in 1964 for the BBC Great War series.
And we went to the front line. We spent about 3 days up at the front. Then we came back for about 3 days in support trenches, and then 3 days at rest, and then we went back again to the front line. So it was just a dull routine.
We'd be chatting all day, talking about how we thought the war was going and what they'd be doing at home, and, things like that. Wishing you were at home, and talking about your relations. Anything to pass the time on.
On the way up, we used to lose a few people on the way up because there were no communication trenches at all. And you had to walk over the top. And being a Scots regiment, of course, we wore kilts. And it was very unpleasant to jump down into a trench with 2 feet of water in it wearing a kilt, because under the kilt we didn't wear anything, any undergarment. And you can imagine how cold it was.
Contrary to the popular myth, men didn't live in the trenches 365 days a year. The British Army quickly realised that too long in the front line would destroy a unit's health, morale and integrity. So units were rotated regularly. Of course, in battles or moments of crisis, men could spend more time in the firing line. Conditions could be brutal. The men lived with the threat of enemy artillery and sniper fire, waterlogged ground, poor food, and hastily buried corpses of previous occupants were often half exposed. Historian Peter Hart, whose interviews form the backbone of the Imperial War Museum collection, interviewed George Ashurst in 1987, when George was 92. George, a Lancashireman, went to the Western Front aged 19. And you can really hear Peter teasing out the details that are now so valuable to posterity.
Did you not have latrines?
No, not in the trench.
Not at that time, anyway?
No, we didn't have latrines.
So there were no latrine arrangements at all?
Not there, no.
So what would they do in the middle of the day?
You'd have to manage. You'd get it done in the trench, that's all.
What, and cover it up yourself?
Yes, shovel it out and cover it up or something.
And during the night you'd go...
Nip over the back of the trench, run a few yards, get down and do it.
How did you manage for paper and things like that?
Paper? God knows. You didn't do any sort of paper. We've used grass and leaves and all sorts of damn things you'd use if you had no paper. So if you didn't get it on your shirt, you'd get it off somewhere. You know. You weren't really bothered.
Northern France and Belgium can be as wet as Britain. It rained, and when it did so, the trenches became drainage ditches, particularly in low-lying Flanders, where the water table was high and the peacetime drainage system had been destroyed by shelling. If your feet are soaked for a long time in unsanitary conditions, they will get devoured by a fungus. If left untreated, it can lead to gangrene, which required amputation. Early in the war, thousands of soldiers needed to be sent to the rear to recover in hospitals. The response was tough. Orders came through that soldiers need to keep their feet warm, dry and clean. It became an offence not to take necessary precautions.
Before we went up to occupy the trench mortar post, we had a session in Ypres at which all our feet were massaged with whale oil. And at the end of the session, we were inspected by an officer to see that every man had properly whale oiled his feet, and that is why we never had any foot trouble.
Looking at some of the problems of trench life, how long was it before you had problems with lice?
From starting to wear your sheepskin coats, they were creeping out of your neck up here, and they were in your seams, and run a match up them, you know. There were a candlelight better, lasted longer. Run that up the seam and burn every egg there was. You could hear them crack, crack, crack when you burned them. You didn't burn the shirt, you just run the flame up. It was sufficient to burn the eggs. They didn't hurt. They were simply itchy, that's all. You know, you could scratch. Especially here between the shoulders they used to get. But you'd be sat talking to a chap like this, you know, and you'd see one come up his shirt neck and walk up his neck, you know. In the summertime, we used to put our bayonet on our rifle and stick it in the ground with the bayonet, and then hang our shirt on. And the sun used to bring them all to the top, out of the shirt, and they were squirming on the top in a big lump of lice, you know, squirming on the top in the sunshine. And then we used to put a flame to it, a lot, and burn.
But however creatively the men adapted to life in the trenches, death was never far away. Interviewed in 1964 for the BBC Great War series, Monsieur Fenetrier served with the French army.
Mud, rain, cold, sleep, it was awful. We used to live there like beasts, really. Impossible to sit, to be seated. I remember once I was obliged to sit on the corpses of French soldiers to eat my lunch. And I did that because I was hungry. It was terrible.
Just over the top, probably 100 yards, 150 yards, there were some potatoes growing.
Joe Armstrong was stationed near the Aisne River.
And one chap said, I'm going to have some of those potatoes if they blow me blinking head off. He got out of the trench, I got the potatoes. It was really fantastic. He got the whole of a shell, took his head clean off his shoulders. There'd be a shell about you know, at £8 or whatever it was, I don't know. I'm going to have some of those potatoes if they blow my blinking head off. And that happened. It sounds a bit fantastic, but it's true.
I had a length of trench. I was in charge of it, Lance Corporal, but I was in charge with 4 men. And then there was a Travis and the next gang. Well, morning at dawn, an officer's coming round to see how things are going. And I had my sentry, a lad named Brown from Manchester. He's standing on his firing step in the corner near the Travis to look at Jerry, you know. Anyway, we can hear this officer shouting at somebody next door. He's playing out with them for not being on sentry or something like that, you know. He's playing hell with them anyway, we can hear his voice. And Brown, on sentry, he can hear it too. So what does he think? Oh, yes, bloody officer. He gets on the step and he looks out. Just a second too long, they get him. So he dropped down. And he's only just dropped off floor and the officer comes round. Just dropped off floor and the officer comes round and we're picking him up. Anyway, it was a waste of time. It went in there and it took a hole out of his head that big, at the top of his head.
3 or 4 inches.
Yeah, at the top of his head. We bandaged him up and laid him on the firing step, you know, and he died there. He was the first casualty in my life in the war. Brown, his name, was from Manchester. We do believe, and I believe, although I never saw it, that he had fixed guns, Jerry. He was cute like that, you know. When he'd noticed where one of our centres generally bobbed up to look, he fixed a gun there, you know. And without looking or anything, while he walked along the trench, he just pulled the trigger. He probably caught Brown with that trick, you see.
After the appalling losses at Ypres and the onset of winter, both sides dug in. For the next 3 terrible years, both sides would make titanic efforts to break the stalemate of the trenches at a terrible cost. Yet for all the lives and resources expended, the front line never moved more than a few miles. The First World War's popular reputation for futility was born out of this bitter trench warfare. It would take a rapid change in tactics and technology to allow one side, finally, to break the deadlock.
It was boring, really, every day, because there were long days, you know. And you were fed up when time come. You were fed up and ready for getting out of that trench, you know. When your 4 days were up, you'd chip the steps in your side, ready for these men arriving, you know. No, they'd come probably get about midnight or something like that when they arrived. And they'd come in single ones and 2 or 3 together and making their way across the ploughed field, you know, to the trench. Hello, lads, come on. We'd get out as quick as ever we could. Right, and away we'd go.